Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this channel. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you don't fall asleep without supporting this content, and so that YouTube continues to offer more videos like this. You are about to embark on a peaceful and fascinating journey about one of the most complex characters to ever exist in human mythology, presented in a light and fluid way, perfect to accompany your evening. This video was created to transform curiosity into knowledge in an easy way. Here, you'll discover little-known details about Thor. Not the movie superhero, but the original Norse god who inspired thousands of years of culture, art, and spirituality. Facts about his human origins, cultural secrets hidden in the Eddas, key moments that shaped entire civilizations. All narrated in a calm, thoughtful, hypnotic, and informative way, so that you can absorb the knowledge even with your eyes closed. Because learning can be simple, enjoyable, and silently transformative. And before we continue, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this video from? Now, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey through the true story of Thor. Part 1. The birth of a god, human roots. The name that echoed through time. Thor, just 4 letters. But this name carried storms through 1,000 years of human history. In Old Norse, the name was RR, pronounced with guttural sound that imitated distant thunder. The word derives from a Proto-Germanic root meaning thunder or rumble. But here's the fascinating detail. The same linguistic root appears in dozens of Indo-European languages, suggesting that the idea of a thunder god predates even the Vikings. The Germanic peoples called him Donner. The Anglo-Saxons said Thunr. Each culture that encountered storms in the sky created its own version of this archetype. But it was in cold and brutal Scandinavia that Thor gained his most human, most imperfect, most real form. Thursday, the day that belongs to Thor. Did you know that every Thursday on the Western calendar is a direct tribute to Thor? In English, Thursday comes from Thor's Day, literally the Day of Thor. The Romans dedicated this day to Jupiter, their own thunder god. When Germanic tribes adopted the Roman calendar, they replaced Jupiter with Thor, recognizing the equivalence between the two. This was not a random act. It was a cultural declaration. Thor was as important to the Norse as Jupiter was to Rome, perhaps even more so, because while Jupiter ruled from distant Olympus, Thor walked among humans, the family that shaped the god. Thor was not born from an immaculate divine conception. He was the son of Odin, the father of all, and Jord, the earth itself personified. This detail is crucial. While Odin represented wisdom, magic, and manipulation, Thor inherited the raw strength of the earth, the firmness of the ground beneath our feet. His mother rarely appears in preserved myths. Jord is mentioned briefly, almost like a footnote, but her narrative absence reveals something deep about Norse culture. Thor's role was to protect the world his mother personified, not glorify her through stories. He was a manifestation of filial duty transformed into cosmic purpose, the forgotten brother. Few know that Thor had a half-brother named Mjölnir, mentioned only once in the poetic Edda. Mjölnir remains a shadow in Norse history. Some scholars suggest that Mjölnir may have been a forgotten deity, absorbed by Thor's dominant figure as myths consolidated. This reminds us that mythology is not static. It evolves, adapts, forgets characters that no longer serve the cultural purpose. Thor survived because he represented something essential to the Norse people, tangible protection against a hostile world. Part 2, Mjölnir, more than a weapon. The hammer, that wasn't a hammer. Mjölnir, the most famous weapon in Norse mythology. But here's something few know. Originally, Mjölnir may not have been a hammer. Some linguistic interpretations suggest the word means that which crushes or that which grinds to dust. It could have been a club, a war axe, or something completely different. The representation as a hammer probably emerged during the Christianization of Scandinavia. Christian missionaries noticed that the symbol of the cross was gaining ground, so pagans began using hammer-shaped pendants as a direct visual contrast. Thor's hammer became a symbol of cultural resistance, forged in error, perfect in purpose. The story of Mjölnir's creation is one of the most human narratives in Norse mythology. The dwarves Sindri and Brock were forging the hammer when Loki, disguised as a fly, bit Brock on the eye. The distraction caused the hammer's handle to come out shorter than planned. This defect is fascinating. Thor wielded an imperfect weapon. It didn't have the ideal balance. The handle was too short to be used comfortably with both hands. And yet, it became the most powerful weapon in the 9 worlds. The cultural message here is profound. Perfection is not necessary for effectiveness. Work with what you have. Transform limitations into defining characteristics. The 3 magical properties. Mjölnir possessed 3 characteristics that made it unique among divine weapons. First, it always hit its target, regardless of how far it was thrown. Second, it always returned to Thor's hand after being thrown. Third, it could be shrunk and carried inside Thor's shirt when not in use. This third property is rarely discussed, but reveals something important. Thor didn't constantly parade with his hammer. He stored it away. This made him more human, less ostentatious. The power was available when needed, but didn't define every moment of his existence. The hammer that blessed. Here's a surprising fact. Mjölnir wasn't used only to destroy giants. It was also a tool of consecration. Thor used the hammer to bless marriages, births, and funerals. He touched the hammer to brides to ensure fertility, placed it in cradles to protect newborns, used it to sanctify funeral pyres. This completely transforms our understanding of Thor. He wasn't just a warrior. He was a cosmic priest, connecting the divine to the everyday through his hammer. In archaeological excavations throughout Scandinavia, thousands of Thor's hammer pendants have been found, used as protective amulets. Some date from the 9th century, proving that common people carried Thor's symbol the same way Christians carry crosses. Part 3. Asgard, the home that wasn't a paradise. Mjölnir, the largest hall of the gods. While Odin reigned in Valhalla, Thor had his own hall called Mjölnir, which means lightning's flicker or that which shines for a moment. It was described as the largest building in all of Asgard, containing 540 rooms. This number is not arbitrary. In Norse numerology, large numbers represented abundance and hospitality. Mjölnir was a place where mortal heroes were received, where common warriors could sit beside a god. It wasn't exclusive like Valhalla, where only those who died in battle were admitted. Thor chose generosity over exclusivity. His home reflected his values. Thrudheim, the realm of strength. Mjölnir was located in Thrudheim, the realm of strength. This region of Asgard belonged entirely to Thor. It wasn't a conquered territory, but a domain granted by Odin in recognition of Thor's essential role in defending the 9 worlds. Thrudheim was described as a place of open plains, vast skies, and constant storms. It didn't have the architectural grandeur of other parts of Asgard, but possessed something more valuable: authenticity. It was a place where strength was celebrated, but not glorified beyond reason. Thor's family, love in divine times. Thor was married to Sif, the golden-haired goddess. Her hair wasn't just hair. It represented wheat fields, the harvest, the abundance of the earth. When Loki cut Sif's hair as a cruel prank, it wasn't just vandalism. It was a symbolic attack on agricultural prosperity. Thor's reaction was immediate and violent. He nearly killed Loki, stopping only when Loki promised to replace the hair with threads of real gold, forged by dwarves. This episode reveals something crucial about Thor. He was a fierce protector of his family, incapable of tolerating humiliation or harm against those he loved. Magni and Modi, the sons of the storm. Thor had 2 principal sons, Magni, whose name means strength, and Modi, which means courage. These names weren't metaphorical. They were aspirational. In a culture that valued these attributes above almost everything, giving these names to sons was declaring they would carry Thor's legacy of protection. In one myth, Magni demonstrates extraordinary strength as a child. When Thor gets trapped under the leg of a dead giant named Hrungnir, none of the gods can move the weight. Magni, at only 3 years old, lifts the leg easily and frees his father. Thor rewards his son with the dead giant horse. This gesture is significant. Thor not only praised Magni, but equipped him for future battles. He was preparing the next generation of protectors. Thrud, the forgotten daughter. Thor also had a daughter named Thrud, which means strength in the feminine. She appears rarely in preserved myths, but her existence challenges the notion that Norse mythology was exclusively masculine in its celebration of strength. Thrud was courted by dwarves, which created diplomatic conflicts in Asgard. Thor didn't treat her as property to be negotiated. He respected her autonomy, although he was clearly protective. This dynamic suggests that, even in a warrior culture, there were nuances in divine family relationships. Part 4. The true nature of Thor, divine humanity, the god who ate. Unlike many deities who exist on ethereal planes feeding on ambrosia or nectar, Thor ate. A lot. There was a famous myth where Thor and Loki visit a giant named Utgard-Loki. During a banquet, Thor participates in an eating contest against an opponent named Logi. Thor devours meat quickly, but Loki not only eats the meat, he consumes the bones, the plate, and even the table. Thor loses. Later, it's revealed that Loki was actually wildfire personified. Thor literally competed against a natural element and almost won. This myth reveals that Thor had real physical appetites. He was an ascetic. He appreciated bodily pleasures, food, drink, companionship. This made him infinitely more accessible to worshippers who also experienced hunger, thirst, and celebration. The god who slept. Thor slept. This seems obvious, but consider, many deities are described as eternally vigilant, never resting. Heimdall, the guardian of Asgard, needed less sleep than a bird. Odin sacrificed comfort for wisdom, but Thor slept deeply. There was a myth where giants stole Mjölnir while Thor slept. He didn't notice immediately. When he woke and discovered the theft, his reaction was very human. Confusion, anger, shame. This detail matters because it shows vulnerability. Thor had moments when he wasn't in absolute control. He could be caught off guard. And in those moments, he depended on friends and allies to help him recover what was lost. The temper that burned. Thor had a notorious temper. He didn't meditate on injustices. He reacted instantly. When giants threatened Asgard, Thor didn't convene councils or debates. He grabbed Mjölnir and immediately went to solve the problem with decisive violence. This characteristic was seen as positive in Norse culture. Hesitation was weakness. Quick action was virtue. But the myths didn't paint Thor's temper as infallibly correct. There were consequences. Relationships were strained. Problems were occasionally aggravated. Thor's temper was a double-edged tool, just like Mjölnir. Effective, but dangerous if misdirected. The complex relationship with Loki. Thor and Loki were an unlikely duo. Loki was cunning, manipulative, constantly creating problems. Thor was direct, honest, a problem solver. And yet, they traveled together frequently. Why? Because Thor recognized that strength alone wasn't enough. Giants could be deceived in ways they couldn't be killed. Problems could require subtlety that Thor didn't naturally possess. So he kept Loki around, despite constant frustrations. This partnership reveals surprising maturity. Thor knew his limitations. He supplemented his weaknesses with other strengths, even when those others were inconvenient and irritating. Part 5. The Great Journeys, Adventures Beyond Asgard. The Journey to Jotunheim, Facing the Unknown. One of the longest and most complex stories about Thor involves a journey to the realm of the giants, Jotunheim. Thor, Loki, and 2 human servants, Jalfi and Roskva, travel to test their strength against the giants. During the night, they shelter in what they think is a large cave. In the morning, they discover they were sleeping inside the glove of a giant named Skrymir, so enormous that his glove could comfortably house 4 people. Imagine this visually. A glove so large it seems like a hall. A giant so immense that Thor, the strongest of the gods, was comparatively the size of an insect. This was a moment of forced humility for Thor. The 3 blows that didn't strike. While Skrymir slept, he snored so loudly that trees trembled. Irritated and unable to sleep, Thor decided to kill the giant. He raised Mjölnir and brought it down with all his strength on Skrymir's forehead. Skrymir woke casually and asked if a leaf had fallen on his head. Thor was stunned. He tried again later with even more force. Skrymir woke asking if an acorn had fallen. A third attempt made Skrymir ask if birds had dropped branches. Thor failed 3 times. For the first time in countless narratives, His raw strength was insufficient. This wasn't a literal failure. As we would discover later, it was magical illusion. But in the moment, Thor experienced genuine powerlessness. The impossible challenges of Utgard. Eventually, Thor and his companions arrived at the castle of Utgard-Loki, king of the giants. There, they were challenged to prove their abilities. Each challenge was designed to be impossible, though Thor didn't know this initially. Thor was challenged to drink from a horn. It seemed simple, but after 3 enormous gulps, the liquid level barely dropped. He was challenged to lift a cat from the ground. He only managed to make one paw lose contact with the floor. He was challenged to wrestle an old woman named Ellie. She brought him to his knees. Each failure devastated Thor's ego. For the first time, he questioned his own strength. The revelation that changed everything. When they were leaving Utgard, the giant king revealed the truth. The horn was connected to the ocean. Thor literally drank so much he created the tides. The cat was Jormungandr, the world serpent that encircles all of Earth. Thor almost lifted the entire world. The old woman was Ellie, the personification of old age. No one can defeat time, but Thor fought until forced to his knees. Thor hadn't failed. He had accomplished the impossible, just didn't recognize it because he was measuring success by the wrong standards. This story is transformative. It teaches that sometimes we're fighting against forces so large that even small progress is monumental victory. Thor learned humility, but also gained perspective on his own magnitude. The cosmic fishing trip. One of the most visually impressive myths involves Thor fishing. He went fishing with a giant named Hymir. Thor used the head of an ox as bait and cast his line into the deep ocean. Something bit. Something absolutely colossal. Thor hooks Jormungandr, the World Serpent. He began to pull, muscles tensed, determined to bring the serpent to the surface and kill it. Hymir was terrified. If Thor brought the serpent to the surface, Ragnarok could begin prematurely. So Hymir cut the fishing line. The serpent escaped back to the depths. Thor was furious. He had been so close to eliminating an existential threat to the 9 worlds. And he was stopped not by enemies, but by a reluctant ally's fear. This myth reveals something profound about Norse destiny. There were things that not even Thor could change before the appointed time. Ragnarok would come eventually, and Thor would face Jormungandr. But not yet. Not here. The moment wasn't right. Part 6. The enemies, giants and serpents. Why Thor hated giants. Thor killed more giants than any record could count. But why? Giants weren't uniformly evil. Some were wise. Some were allies of the gods. Odin, Thor's father, was half giant through his mother. The answer lies in cosmological purpose. Giants represented primordial chaos, untamed natural forces. Thor was order manifested. He didn't hate giants personally. He hated them functionally. They were obstacles to stability that allowed civilization to exist. Each giant killed by Thor was a storm tamed, a mountain made climbable, a river forced to flow within banks. Thor was literally terraforming the cosmos through sacred violence. Hrungnir, the only one who almost won. Hrungnir was the most formidable giant Thor faced before Ragnarok. He had a heart of whetstone, literally made of hard, sharp rock, forming 3 points. His head was stone. He carried a stone shield and a whetstone as a weapon. Thor and Hrungnir agreed to a formal duel. When they met, Hrungnir threw his whetstone. Thor threw Mjölnir. The weapons collided in midair. Mjölnir shattered the whetstone and continued, crushing Hrungnir's skull. But fragments of the whetstone struck Thor, lodging in his forehead. Hrungnir fell dead, but his leg pinned Thor to the ground. None of the gods had moved the leg, until Magni, Thor's 3-year-old son, lifted it easily. That fragment in Thor's forehead remained there until Ragnarok. It was a permanent reminder that even victories come with scars. THOR, the thief of Mjölnir. Perhaps the most humorous story about Thor involves the giant THOR, who stole Mjölnir while Thor slept. THOR sent a message. He would return the hammer only if he received Freya, the goddess of love, as a bride. Freya furiously refused. The gods panicked. Without Mjölnir, Asgard was vulnerable. Then Heimdall proposed a ridiculous plan. Thor would dress as Freya and go to the wedding in disguise. Thor initially violently refused, but eventually agreed as long as Loki came with him disguised as a handmaiden. Imagine this: Thor, the most masculine of gods, wearing a bridal gown and veil. During the wedding banquet, Thor ate an entire ox, ate salmon, and drank 3 barrels of mead. THRYM was impressed with Freya's appetite. Loki explained that she was so anxious for the wedding she hadn't eaten in days. When Mjölnir was brought to sanctify the union, according to Norse custom, Thor grabbed it and immediately massacred all the giants present. He recovered his hammer through deception and simultaneous violence. This myth is fascinating because it shows Thor willing to sacrifice pride for practical necessity. He temporarily humiliated himself to achieve a greater goal. This was wisdom disguised as comedy. Jormungandr, the destined enemy. Jormungandr, the World Serpent, was Thor's arch-nemesis. Son of Loki and the giantess Angrboda, Jormungandr was cast into the ocean by Odin when still small. There, it grew so large it encircled all of Earth, biting its own tail. Thor and Jormungandr were trapped in a cycle of near-fatal encounters. They faced each other during the fishing trip with Hymir. They would meet again during Ragnarok. There was a mythic quality of inevitability to this rivalry. The serpent represented what Thor couldn't dominate through direct strength. It was too large, was everywhere, was both the ocean and the creature within it. Fighting Jormungandr was fighting against the very nature of the world. And yet, Thor would try, because that was his essential nature, to face impossibilities until they became possibilities. Part 7, Thor Among Mortals, the Accessible God, the Human Servants. Thor had 2 human servants, Jalfi and Roskva. They weren't born servants. They became part of Thor's entourage through a tragically human family mistake. Thor visited their parents' farm. He killed his goats for dinner, but instructed the family not to break any bones. The next day, he would resurrect the goats using Mjölnir. But Jalfi, curious and hungry, broke a leg bone to suck the marrow. When Thor resurrected the goats the next morning, one was lame. He was furious, but the parents, terrified, offered their children as compensation. Thor accepted, but didn't treat them cruelly. They traveled with him, learned from him, became part of his extended family. This myth reveals something crucial. Thor interacted directly with mortals. He ate in their homes, slept in their halls, took them on adventures. He wasn't a distant god. He was a supernatural neighbor. Jalfi, the fastest of mortals. Jalfi developed an extraordinary ability: speed. He became the fastest of all humans, able to run long distances without tiring. During the visit to Utgard, Jalfi competed in a race against an opponent named Hugi. He lost 3 times. Later, it was revealed that Hugi was actually thought personified. Nothing is faster than thought. But Jalfi had run against an abstract concept and almost won. This elevated his humanity to nearly divine levels. Roskva, the forgotten sister. Roskva rarely appears in stories, but her constant presence suggests importance. Some interpretations suggest she managed Thor's household when he traveled, organized his hall, coordinated hospitality for visitors. In a culture where hospitality was sacred, this role wasn't trivial. Roskva would have been essential to keeping Bilskirner functioning as the community center Thor wanted it to be. Her narrative invisibility doesn't mean insignificance. It means she did her job, so while it didn't create crises that generated stories. The farmer who saved his son. There's a lesser-known myth where Thor resurrected the dead son of a farmer. The family was devout to Thor, always making proper offerings. When the son died of illness, the father prayed to Thor with genuine desperation. Thor, moved by compassion, descended to Midgard and used Mjölnir to restore life to the boy. But there was a cost. The boy remembered nothing of the time dead. It was as if he had slept deeply and awakened. This myth is profound because it shows Thor responding not to grand cosmic crises, but to the individual suffering of a family that honored him. His power wasn't just for battles. It was for healing, for restoration, for mercy. The offerings Thor received. Thor's worshippers made practical offerings. Not incense or elaborate chants, but food, drink, and occasionally broken weapons as symbols of gratitude for victories. There was a sense of reciprocity. Thor protected, and mortals reciprocated with hospitality he genuinely appreciated. Archaeological sites in Scandinavia have revealed Thor's houses, small structures where communities left offerings. Some contained bones of sacrificed animals, shared in communal meals where Thor was considered an invisible guest. This transformed worship into a shared meal. Thor wasn't above mortals in a distant hierarchy. He was sitting at the table with them, sharing the same food, celebrating the same victories. Part 8. The magical object beyond Mjölnir. Mjölnir, the belt that doubles strength. Thor possessed a belt called Mjölnir, which means belt of strength. When worn, it doubled his already supernatural strength. This raises a fascinating question. If Thor was already unbeatable strong, why did he need a magical belt? The answer suggests that even gods have limits. There were threats so large that even Thor needed amplification. The belt wasn't a crutch. It was a strategic tool for exceptional situations. Imagine a warrior so powerful that his standard equipment included an item others would consider an ultimate relic. This scales the level of threats Thor faced regularly. Jarngraper, the iron gloves. Thor couldn't simply grab Mjölnir with bare hands. The hammer was so powerful, it would burn even divine flesh. So he wore Jarngraper, gloves made of magical iron that allowed him to wield a hammer safely. This detail adds layers of realism. Mjölnir wasn't just heavy, it was fundamentally dangerous, even to its owner. Thor needed protection against his own weapon. This humanizes him deeply. It's like a welder wearing protection against the heat of his own torch. Powerful tools require respect and caution, even from masters. Tangrisnir and Tangjastr, the immortal goats. Thor didn't ride a horse like Odin. He drove a chariot pulled by two goats, Tangrisnir, teeth bearer, and Tangjastr, teeth grinder. These weren't ordinary goats. They were immortal and magical. Here's the most surprising detail. Thor could kill and eat these goats at night. In the morning, he would use Mjölnir to resurrect them, as long as all bones were kept intact and placed inside the skins. The goats would come back to life, ready to continue pulling the chariot. This made Thor self-sufficient on his travels. He carried his own renewable food supply, but it also demonstrated the dual power of Mjölnir, not just destruction but restoration. Thunder as transportation. When Thor traveled across the sky in his chariot, the wheels created the sound of thunder. Lightning was sparks from Mjölnir colliding with clouds. Storms were literally the trail of Thor crossing worlds. This transformed natural phenomena into theological narrative. Each storm was evidence that Thor was working, defending, traveling. The sky was his road, and mortals could hear his progress. Norse children learned from early on. When you hear thunder, Thor is hunting giants. When you see lightning, he found one. Meteorology became mythology, became comfort. The world wasn't randomly violent. It was being actively protected. Part 9. The Christianization when Thor met Christ. The cultural confrontation. When Christian missionaries arrived in Scandinavia starting in the 8th century, they encountered populations that worshiped Thor as their primary protector. The transition wasn't smooth. There was resistance, conflict, and complex syncretism. Some Vikings saw Christ and Thor as compatible. Christ had been crucified and resurrected. This demonstrated power. Thor fought monsters and protected humans. This also demonstrated power. Some archaeological pendants show Christian symbols, and Thor's hammers fuse on the same object. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was religious pragmatism. If multiple gods could offer protection, why not honor all? The gradual fall. Thor wasn't defeated by theological arguments. He was marginalized economically and politically. Kings who converted to Christianity brought Christian trade networks. Christian churches offered literacy services, writing, and international diplomacy. Worshipping Thor became a mark of cultural isolation. Slowly, community after community converted, not necessarily by conviction, but by convenience. But Thor didn't disappear completely. He was pushed into folklore. His stories were preserved by Christian scholars like Snorri Sturluson, who recognized cultural value even while promoting the new religion. Syncretism, Thor disguised. In some regions, Thor was subtly merged with Saint Michael, the warrior archangel who defeats dragons. Both were celestial protectors. Both wielded iconic weapons. The transition was easier when the new god resembled the old one. Some Thor festivals were renamed as Christian celebrations. Dates were maintained, rituals slightly modified. The structure remained, only the nomenclature changed. This wasn't betrayal. It was cultural survival. People adapted by maintaining as much of their traditions as possible while avoiding persecution. The modern resurgence. In the 19th century, during Romantic nationalism, Thor experienced a cultural renaissance. Scandinavian artists, poets, and musicians recovered Norse mythology as a source of national identity distinct from Christian European influences. Richard Wagner incorporated Thor as Donner into his Ring of the Nibelung. Visual artists painted dramatic scenes of Thor's battles. Thor became a symbol of Scandinavian cultural pride. This trend continued in the 20th and 21st centuries. Neo-pagan movements revived Thor worship, sometimes as genuine religious practice, other times as an expression of cultural heritage. And then came Marvel Comics in 1962, recreating Thor for a global audience as a superhero. This created Thor more famous globally than he ever was in the Viking Age. Ironic, but transformative. Part 10, Thor in the Texts, Eddas, and Sagas. The Poetic Edda, Surviving Verses. Our understanding of Thor comes primarily from the Poetic Edda, a collection of ancient Norse poems preserved in a 13th century Icelandic manuscript called the Codex Regius. These poems were originally composed centuries earlier, transmitted orally, finally written after Christianization. One poem, Rimskvia, the Lay of THRYM, tells the story of THRYM stealing Mjölnir. Another, Hymiskvia, the Lay of Hymir, describes the fishing of Jormungandr. These weren't formal religious texts. They were entertainment that also taught cultural values. The poetry was highly structured, using complex alliteration and kennings, compound metaphors. Thor was described as friend of mankind, slayer giants, son of earth. Each description revealed an aspect of his character. The prose Edda. Snorri explains everything. Snorri Sturluson, a 13th century Christian Icelandic writer, wrote the prose Edda partially as a handbook for poets who wished to use Norse mythology in their work. He systematically explained who the gods were, their stories, and relationships. The Skaldskaparmal section contains many Thor stories in narrative detail that don't appear in the Poetic Edda. The Gylfaginning section presents Thor through dialogue between a disguised king and gods. Snorri was Christian, but respected the traditions of his ancestors. He preserved stories that otherwise would have been lost. Without him, we would know much less about Thor. The Icelandic sagas, Thor in daily life. Icelandic sagas were stories about family feuds and adventures of Icelandic settlers. Though they focus on humans, Thor appeared frequently as a background force. Storms were attributed to him. Oaths were made in his name. Pendants were worn for protection. One saga mentions a man named Thorstein, Thorstone, refusing to convert to Christianity because he believed Thor had protected him in battle. When he finally converted, he kept his name as a connection to heritage. These casual references reveal how Thor was integrated into daily life. He wasn't just a distant mythological figure. He was a constant presence, invoked in critical moments. The runic inscriptions, Thor in stone, hundreds of rune stones throughout Scandinavia, invoke Thor. Common inscriptions include, "May Thor sanctify these runes," or "May Thor protect this memorial." One particularly interesting stone in Viring, Denmark, clearly shows a figure with a hammer facing a large serpent, clearly representing Thor versus Jormungandr. It dates from the 10th century, demonstrating this story was popular even before the Eddas were written. These inscriptions weren't mere religious texts. They were practical requests for protection for the dead, for property, for travelers. Thor was invoked as a tangible guardian, not a theoretical concept. Part 11, Ragnarok, the destined end. The inevitable prophecy. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, was foretold from the beginning. The Norse gods knew exactly how and when they would die. This was a unique characteristic of Norse mythology. There was no guaranteed final victory, only noble resistance against inevitable destruction. Thor had a central role in Ragnarok. He would fight against his arch-nemesis, Jormungandr, in a final battle. But the outcome was predetermined. The Fimbulwinter. Ragnarok would be preceded by Fimbulwinter, 3 consecutive winters without intermediate summer. Snow would cover all worlds. Families would be destroyed. Brothers would fight against brothers. Morality would collapse. Thor couldn't prevent this. No god could. It was a consequence of events already in motion since the creation of the cosmos. During this period, Thor would continue killing giants, but it would be an increasingly futile effort. Chaos was winning. Order was unraveling. Fenrir unleashed. The wolf Fenrir, imprisoned by the gods since youth, would finally break free. He would devour Odin during Ragnarok. Thor wouldn't be there to save his father. He would be occupied elsewhere on the battlefield. This separation is significant. Thor and Odin represented different philosophies. Odin valued knowledge, sacrificed everything for wisdom. Thor valued action, protected through strength. In the end, each would face consequences of their choices alone. The serpent emerges. Jormungandr would emerge in the ocean, poisoning the skies with its breath. Waves would flood lands. The world would be literally turned inside out as the serpent uncoiled. Thor would go to meet it. Finally, the battle that had been building through multiple encounters would reach its conclusion. The final duel. Thor and Jormungandr would face each other on the battlefield of Vigrid. Thor would raise Mjölnir. The serpent would attack with poison fangs. They would collide with force sufficient to shatter mountains. Thor would crush the serpent's skull with Mjölnir. Jormungandr would die, but in the process, it would cover Thor with venom. Thor would manage to take Continuer 11:10, 9 steps away from the serpent's body before falling dead. 9 steps. Sacred number in Norse numerology. Odin had hanged himself on Yggdrasil for 9 nights to gain runic knowledge. 9 were the worlds. Thor would take 9 final steps, and then it would end. The death that wasn't defeat. Thor would kill his greatest enemy. He would die fulfilling his function. There was no tragedy in this. According to the Norse mentality, there was only fulfillment of purpose. Heroes weren't defined by living forever. They were defined by fighting well against impossibilities. Thor did exactly that until literally his last step. What survives? After Ragnarok, the world would be destroyed and reborn. Some gods would survive, including Magni and Modi, Thor's sons. They would inherit Mjölnir and rebuild the world with their father's philosophy of strength and protection. Thor didn't survive, but his legacy did. His values, his approach, his equipment. Everything would pass to the new generation. Immortality not through eternal life, but through enduring influence. Part 12. Symbolism. What Thor truly represented. Protection of the familiar against the strange. Thor was fundamentally about protecting the known against the unknown. Asgard and Midgard, home of humans, were civilization. Jotunheim, home of giants, was savagery. Thor defended the boundary. This had deep psychological resonance. We all live in circles of familiarity, surrounded by potentially threatening unknown. Thor personified the impulse to protect our safe space. It wasn't simple xenophobia. It was recognition that order requires active maintenance against natural entropy. Without constant effort, civilization falls into chaos. Thor was that effort personified. Moral strength versus physical strength. Though Thor was physically powerful, his stories frequently emphasized moral strength, persistence, loyalty, courage. He humiliated himself by wearing a bridal gown to recover Mjölnir. He accepted human servants instead of punishing them excessively. Strength wasn't just musculature. It was character tested under pressure. Thor failed sometimes, but always got up and tried again. That was perhaps his most admirable attribute. In a culture that valued warrior capabilities so much, it was significant that their most popular war god demonstrated vulnerability, made mistakes, needed help. This made strength achievable for common mortals. Storm as ambiguity. Thor controlled storms, which were both destructive and beneficial. Lightning killed, but rain nurtured crops. Thunder frightened, but announced needed rain. Thor embodied this duality. He wasn't simply good. He was necessary. His violence served purpose. His storms cleansed as much as they destroyed. This was a more sophisticated understanding of morality than nuance-free heroism. Vikings lived in a brutal world. They didn't need perfectly moral gods. They needed effective gods who understood that sometimes violence was a necessary tool for survival. Divine accessibility. Thor was the most worshipped god not because he was most powerful. Odin technically was superior. But because he was most accessible. He had mortal appetites, recognizable limitations, understandable relationships. When Vikings prayed to Thor, they weren't addressing an unattainable cosmic king. They were talking to a protector who genuinely cared about their well-being, who ate the same food, appreciated the same beer, valued the same hospitality. This accessibility made worship feel like partnership instead of subordination. Thor was on your side, fighting your battles on a cosmic scale. The archetype of the protector. Thor represents a universal archetype of the protector. One who places themselves between loved ones and danger, regardless of personal cost. This is a function that transcends culture. Parents protecting children. Soldiers protecting compatriots. Firefighters entering burning buildings. All these actions echo Thor. The instinct to protect others at cost of oneself is coded deeply in the human psyche. Thor personified this instinct in its purest and most elevated form. He didn't protect because he received something in return, but because protection was his fundamental nature. It was what he was. Part 13. Thor in Modern Culture. Wagner and Romanticism. Richard Wagner incorporated Thor, called Donner in the opera, into his epic work, Der Ring des Nibelungen, The Ring of the Nibelung. Wagner was fascinated by Germanic mythology and used it to create an opera exploring power, betrayal, and destiny. Donner in Wagner isn't a main character, but his appearance creating a storm and rainbow for the gods to cross to Valhalla is one of the most memorable moments in the work. The music imitates thunder, building from low murmur to full orchestral explosion. This representation reintroduced Thor to a European audience that had forgotten or abandoned Norse mythology during centuries of Christianity. Wagner made Thor cultural again, not religious. Children's literature. Thor domesticated. In the early 20th century, Thor began appearing in children's literature, especially in Scandinavia. These versions were often softened. Thor was strong and brave, but violence was minimized, complexity removed. This domestication had a dual purpose: preserve cultural heritage while making it appropriate for modern children. Thor became a model for courage and persistence without glorifying extreme violence of the original myths. Generations of Scandinavian children grew up knowing Thor through these simplified books, creating cultural connection with ancestors even in secularized societies. Marvel Comics, American reinvention. In 1962, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby introduced Thor as a superhero in Journey into Mystery Number 83. This version borrowed freely from Norse mythology, but altered it dramatically to fit American superhero narratives. Marvel Thor kept Mjölnir, Asgard, Odin, and basic concepts, but added a secret identity: Dr. Donald Blake, modern moral conflicts, and comic book aesthetics. He fought aliens, robots, and supervillains, not just mythological giants. This created a Thor more famous globally than the original version ever was. Millions of people know Thor exclusively through Marvel, never reading the Eddas. Cinematic Thor, global blockbuster. The Marvel Cinematic Universe elevated Thor to a new stratosphere of fame starting in 2011. Played by Chris Hemsworth, Thor became a central character in a film franchise that grossed billions globally. These films took enormous liberties with mythology. Thor travels through technology sufficiently advanced to seem like magic, not through literal cosmology. Loki is an adopted brother instead of a problematic companion. Ragnarok was completely reimagined, but the film successfully transmitted core themes. Thor's protector, his journey from arrogance to humility, his commitment to those he loves. The spirit, if not the letter, remained. Neopaganism, Thor religious again, parallel to cultural popularity. Some people resumed actual worship of Thor through neo-pagan movements like Asatru and Heat Henry. These practitioners attempt to reconstruct pre-Christian religiosity using historical sources. For them, Thor isn't a fictional character or metaphor. He's a real divine force deserving reverence. They make offerings, celebrate seasonal festivals, and try to live according to Norse values like honor, courage, and hospitality. This movement is small, but growing, particularly in Scandinavia, Germany, and North America. Thor has returned as an active religious figure, though on a much smaller scale than during the Viking Age. Appropriation and controversy. Unfortunately, Thor's symbols, particularly Mjölnir, have been appropriated by some white supremacist groups claiming pure European heritage. This created tension. Practicing Norse neopaganism sometimes became politically complex. The majority of Asatru practitioners vehemently reject these associations, arguing that Thor represents protection of all, not supremacy of some. Legal and cultural battles continue over who can legitimately claim Norse heritage. Thor, always protector, now needs to be protected from misinterpretations of his legacy. Part 14, Comparisons, Thor and Other Thunder Gods. Zeus, king versus protector. Zeus, leader of the Greek pantheon, also controlled lightning and thunder, but Zeus was fundamentally different from Thor. Zeus was political, manipulative, often distant. He ruled from Mount Olympus, having affairs with mortals but rarely walking among them as an equal. Thor was a warrior, direct, constantly present. He didn't rule, he protected. Zeus represented hierarchical authority. Thor represented protective service. Even their weapons reflected this. Zeus threw lightning from a distance. Thor dove into close combat with his hammer. Indra, celestial warrior. Indra, Hindu god of storms and war, shares more with Thor. Indra also killed demons to protect cosmic order. He wielded Vajra, a weapon that returned his hand. Similar to Mjölnir, both had prodigious appetites. Indra famously drank soma in enormous quantities. Thor drank mead uncontrollably. Both were celebrated for physical prowess and courage in battle. But Indra was more clearly divine, less humanized. His stories emphasize absolute power more than vulnerability. Thor felt pain, fatigue, frustration. Indra transcended these limitations more consistently. Purin, the forgotten Slavic. Purin, Slavic god of thunder, is less known but structurally similar to Thor. He wielded an axe or hammer, rode across the sky in a chariot, fought against a cosmic serpent called Velis. The similarities suggest shared Indo-European roots. All these thunder gods may derive from a common ancestral archetype developed before cultural migrations separated peoples. But Purin didn't survive Christianization, as well as Thor. Records are fragmentary. Worship was suppressed more completely. Thor was fortunate to have Snorri and others preserving his stories in detail. Raijin, Eastern Thunder. Raijin, Japanese god of thunder, lightning, and storms, offers an interesting contrast. Raijin is portrayed as a demon or oni, not a noble god. He creates storms by beating drums carried on his back. Where Thor represents order defending against chaos, Raijin is a more ambiguous natural force. He isn't actively protecting humanity. He's just expressing the nature of storms. This reveals a deep cultural difference. Norse mythology anthropomorphized nature into protectors and adversaries. Japanese mythology recognized nature as a more neutral force, neither friend nor enemy, just powerful. Thor's uniqueness. Comparisons reveal Thor's essential singularity. He combined divine power with human imperfection in ways few other thunder gods managed. He was strong but not omnipotent, brave but not reckless, protective but not controlling. This particular combination resonated through centuries because it reflected realistic human aspirations. Nobody could be Zeus, too powerful, too distant. But maybe you could, in your best moments, be a bit like Thor. Part 15. Philosophical Lessons Hidden Within. Strength has limits. Thor teaches that even extraordinary strength has limits. He couldn't drink the entire ocean. He couldn't lift Jormungandr completely. He couldn't defeat Ellie. Old age. In a modern culture that glorifies individual power, this is a critical lesson. Recognizing limitations isn't weakness. It's wisdom. It allows using strength effectively within its appropriate domains instead of wasting it against impossibilities. Thor attempted impossibilities repeatedly, but when confronted with the truth of his limitations, he accepted them and continued doing what he could. Pragmatic humility, combined with persistent determination. Tools define capabilities. Thor depended on Mjölnir, Megingjord, and Jarngraper. Without them, he was still formidable, but not invincible. His tools dramatically expanded his capabilities. Humans are also defined by tools. Language extends thought. Technology amplifies strength. Community multiplies individual impact. Thor taught that there's no shame in using tools. There's wisdom in choosing them well. Courage isn't absence of fear. Thor felt fear. When he saw Skrymir's eyes, he was surprised and cautious. When he faced Jormungandr, he knew it would eventually be fatal. But he continued. Norse courage wasn't about absence of fear. It was about acting correctly despite fear. It was doing what needs to be done knowing the cost. This makes courage accessible. You don't need to be recklessly fearless. You just need to act when it matters, even when you're scared. Relationships require compromise. Thor traveled with Loki despite constant frustration, because he recognized he needed Loki's skills. He kept Jalfi and Roskva despite initial anger. He worked with giants when necessary despite usually fighting them. Effective relationships require accepting that people are complex and sometimes irritating. Ideological purity is less important than practical functionality. Thor taught relational pragmatism. Purpose transcends survival. Thor knew he would die at Ragnarok. This didn't make him stop fighting. Purpose wasn't living forever. It was protecting while possible, as well as possible. In an era where many seek immortality through technology or legacy, Thor offers a different perspective. Perhaps the point isn't to last forever, but to matter deeply while you're here. Humility through humiliation. Thor's journey to Utgard was designed to humiliate him. Each challenge was impossible. Each failure was public. And when the truth was revealed, his greatness was proven exactly through the failures. Sometimes we learn more when we fail or are humiliated than when we win easily. Thor emerged from Utgard wiser, more cautious, more respectful of forces he didn't fully understand. Legacy through values, not life. Thor died at Ragnarok, but Magni and Modi survived carrying his values. Thor's lasting legacy wasn't his personal life continuing, but his principles being transmitted. Modern parents face this. You won't live forever, but you can raise children who carry your best qualities forward. Teachers instruct students who will transmit knowledge beyond. Leaders mentor successors who will continue missions. Real immortality is enduring influence, not eternal existence. Part 16. Thor in language. Words that survived. Thursday. Thor's day. As mentioned earlier, Thursday in English comes directly from Thor's day. But this extends to other Germanic languages. In German, Donnerstag, Thunder's Day. In Dutch, Donderdag. Swedish and Norwegian use Torsdag directly. Every week, billions of people say Thor's name, without realizing it. This is linguistic immortality. Presence so integrated into language, it becomes invisible. Thor in place names. Scandinavia is full of place names referencing Thor. Thorshavn, capital of the Faroe Islands, means Thor's harbor. Thorsager in Denmark. Torshälla in Sweden. Torvikbukt in Norway. Each name marks a place where communities particularly honor Thor, perhaps through temples or ritual gatherings. These places became points of cultural connection even after Christianization erased religious practices. Personal names carrying Thor. Thorstein, Thorstone, Thorvald, ruled by Thor, Thorbjorn, Thor's bear, Thora, feminine form. Hundreds of Norse names incorporated Thor, giving children symbolic protection through nominal association. This practice continued through centuries. Even today, these names are used in Scandinavia, carrying direct connection to ancestral mythology. Each person so named is a living reminder of Thor. Thunder in Indo-European languages. The Indo-European root *tunteros, thunder, produced Thor in Norse, but also thunder in English, Donner in German, Torden in Danish. Even in more distant languages, there are parallels to nitrous in Latin, tuono in Italian. This linguistic dispersion suggests the concept of the thunder god is incredibly ancient, predating migrations that separated Indo-European peoples thousands of years ago. Thor is heir to a tradition that may be 5,000 plus years old. Thor's hammer in vocabulary. Mjölnir didn't become a common word in modern languages the way Thursday did, but it influenced specialized vocabulary. In Scandinavian meteorology, certain types of cloud formations were traditionally called Thor's anvil. In mining, particularly heavy hammers were sometimes informally called Thor or Little Mjölnir by Scandinavian workers. Idiomatic expressions. Some Scandinavian expressions preserve references to Thor. May Thor take you was an antiquated curse. Thor is riding meant a strong storm is coming. These expressions have mostly disappeared, replaced by modern idiom, but occasionally surface in literature or among older people in rural areas who maintain stronger connection to linguistic traditions. Part 17. Archaeology, physical evidence of Thor. Hammer pendants, ubiquitous symbols. Thousands of Thor's hammer-shaped pendants have been discovered in excavations throughout Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, and Viking settlements abroad. Made of silver, bronze, iron, amber, even gold for elite examples. These pendants were worn as protective amulets. Analyses of where they were found, in graves, hidden treasures, domestic settlements, suggest all social classes wore them. Thor wasn't a god just of the warrior elite, but of everyone. Some pendants show incredible artistic elaboration. Others are crudely made. This demonstrates that importance wasn't in craftsmanship quality, but in the symbol they represented. Connection with Thor mattered more than object beauty. Rune stones mentioning Thor. Over 100 rune stones mention Thor directly. A common formula was RRVJI, may Thor consecrate. These inscriptions asked Thor's protection for the memorialized person, travelers, or property marked by the stone. One particularly interesting stone in Viking, Denmark, clearly shows a figure with a hammer facing a large serpent, clearly representing Thor versus Jormungandr, demonstrating this story was popular even before being written in the Eddas. Temples and worship sites. Unlike cultures with surviving religious architecture, Vikings built temples primarily of wood, which rotted long ago. But archaeologists have found evidence of structures through patterns of post holes, ritual objects, and layers of sacrificed animal bones. Gamla Uppsala in Sweden was a particularly important worship center. Historical descriptions mention a magnificent temple dedicated to Odin, Thor, and Freyr. Modern excavations confirmed extensive ritual activity at this site for centuries. Amulets and ritual objects. Beyond hammer pendants, archaeologists have found other objects linked to Thor. Small bronze axes, oath rings with inscriptions invoking Thor, even household items decorated with thunder and hammer symbols. These objects reveal how Thor permeated daily life. He wasn't just a figure worshipped on special occasions. He was a constant presence, incorporated into objects used daily. Viking burials with Thor symbols. Some Viking graves contain multiple hammer pendants, suggesting the individual had particular devotion to Thor or the family desired extra protection from Thor for the posthumous journey. Interestingly, some graves contain Christian symbols and Thor pendants simultaneously, evidencing a transition period where people practiced both religions, not necessarily seeing them as mutually exclusive. Part 18. Psychology, Thor and the Human Mind. Archetype of the Warrior Protector. Carl Jung, founder of analytical psychology, identified universal archetypes in the collective unconscious. The warrior is one of these archetypes. Figures who defend, protect, establish boundaries. Thor is a perfect manifestation of this archetype. He established and maintained boundaries between Order, Asgard/Midgard, and chaos, Jotunheim. This is a psychological function as much as mythological. We all need internal capacity to defend our psychological boundaries. When Thor resonates with someone, it's often because they recognize the need to protect something valuable, values, relationships, identity. Thor symbolizes the inner strength to say no more to invasions, balancing strength and control. Thor had immense strength, but needed control appropriately. Using Mjölnir for blessing required the same tool used for destruction, just applied differently. Psychologically, this reflects the challenge of having powerful capabilities, anger, ambition, intense creativity, and directing them constructively. Uncontrolled strength destroys even things you love. Totally suppressed strength makes you powerless. Thor teaches integration. Own your power, but direct it intentionally. Vulnerability and authenticity. Modern psychology values authentic vulnerability. Thor demonstrated this constantly, admitted when overwhelmed, accepted help when needed, showed genuine emotions including frustration and even fear. Cultures that encourage men to be stoic and never show weakness often create psychological dysfunction. Thor offers an alternative model. Be incredibly strong, but also incredibly real. Strength and vulnerability aren't opposites. They're complementary. Purpose as psychological foundation. Viktor Frankl, survivor of Nazi concentration camps, argued humans fundamentally need meaning/purpose more than happiness. Purpose makes suffering bearable. Thor had crystal clear purpose. Protect. This purpose sustained him through battles, humiliations, knowledge of future death. He didn't question why me. He knew exactly why. Modernity often deprives people of a clear sense of purpose. Myths like Thor can help people articulate their own purposes. What am I protecting? Who counts on me? What's worth fighting for? Jungian shadow and the dark side. Jung also wrote about shadow, aspect of ourselves we repress or deny. Thor had shadow, explosive temper, tendency toward violence, impulse to solve everything through force. But unlike some mythological figures who are purely light or darkness, Thor integrated his shadow. He didn't pretend violence wasn't part of him. He recognized it, directed it appropriately, but didn't deny it. Psychological integration requires recognizing destructive capabilities within us without being consumed by them. Thor modeled this perfectly. Ritual and psyche. Thor's worshippers performed rituals, offering sacrifices, blessings with a hammer. Psychologically, rituals serve important functions. Create sense of control, facilitate transitions, connect individuals to communities. Even in secular society, people create personal rituals, morning routines, milestone celebrations, meditative practices. Thor teaches that rituals aren't primitive or irrational. They're psychological tools for structuring experience and creating meaning. Part 19, Thor Morality, Norse Ethics. Justifiable violence. Thor killed constantly. Giants, monsters, occasionally even allies who betrayed him. Was this immoral? According to Norse ethics, no. Violence was a tool, not inherently good or bad. Norse morality focused on loyalty, honor, and purpose more than universal rules. Killing a giant that threatened Asgard wasn't murder. It was legitimate protection. Not punishing betrayal wasn't mercy. It was weakness. This ethic is uncomfortable for modern mentalities influenced by religious traditions that emphasize nonviolence and universal forgiveness, but reflects the reality of a brutal world where survival often required decisive violent action. Hospitality as sacred virtue. A famous story. Thor and Loki visited a poor farm. Despite limited resources, the family shared everything generously. Thor rewarded them by killing his own goats to provide a lavish feast, then resurrecting them the next morning. Hospitality was a central virtue. Denying food or shelter to a traveler was a grave evil. Thor exemplified this by keeping Bilskirner open, accepting humans into his entourage, sharing meals with mortals. Modernity values privacy and individual autonomy. Norse culture valued community and mutual obligation. Thor taught that sharing abundance wasn't optional. It was moral duty. Courage above wisdom. Odin valued wisdom, even sacrificing an eye and hanging himself for knowledge. Thor valued courage, action in the face of danger. Both were virtues, but Thor represented different priorities. Norse ethics didn't see wisdom as always superior to action. Sometimes, overthinking leads to paralysis. Sometimes, what's necessary is someone brave enough to act with imperfect information. Thor teaches it's better to act imperfectly than wait perfectly. This resonates in modern startup cultures. Done is better than perfect. Action generates feedback. Feedback generates learning. Family loyalty. Thor fiercely protected his family. When Loki cut Sif's hair, Thor nearly killed him. When giants threatened to kidnap Freya, Thor intervened immediately. Family loyalty was absolute. You could disagree with family, be frustrated with them, but never abandon them when threatened. This was a central cultural expectation. Modern society sees family relationships as more conditional. If family is toxic, you can and should distance yourself. Norse ethics didn't easily allow this. Thor personified this unbreakable loyalty. Honor through action. Norse honor was earned through deeds, not birth. Yes, Thor was Odin's son, but he was honored because he killed giants, protected gods, fulfilled oaths. Pedigree alone was insufficient. This created partial meritocracy. If you were brave, strong, reliable, you earned respect regardless of origin. Thor exemplified this by accepting Thjalfi and Roskva, children of common farmers, as valued companions. Destiny and responsibility. Norse people believed in fate, W-Y-R-D, but also in individual action. Thor knew he would die at Ragnarok, but this didn't make him fatalistic. He continued fighting, because how he arrived at destiny mattered as much as the destiny itself. You couldn't escape what you were fated for, but you could face it courageously or cowardly. This created ethical framework where acceptance of fate combined with active choice in how to meet it. Thor never passively accepted his fate. He fought toward it with every ounce of strength. That was a Norse ideal, not avoiding destiny, but meeting it magnificently. The ethics of practical protection. Thor's morality was ultimately practical. What protects? What preserves? What allows communities to flourish? These questions guided action more than abstract principles. This pragmatic ethics made Thor relevant to farmers, merchants, warriors, everyone who faced practical challenges of survival and community maintenance. He wasn't a philosopher god. He was a doer god. And in harsh Scandinavian environments where winter could kill, raids could destroy, storms could devastate, a god who prioritized practical protection over theoretical purity made perfect sense. Part 19, Thor Morality, Norse Ethics. Justifiable violence. Thor killed constantly. Giants, monsters, occasionally even allies who betrayed him. Was this immoral? According to Norse ethics, no. Violence was a tool, not inherently good or bad. Norse morality focused on loyalty, honor, and purpose more than universal rules. Killing a giant that threatened Asgard wasn't murder. It was legitimate protection. Not punishing betrayal wasn't mercy. It was weakness. This ethic is uncomfortable for modern mentalities influenced by religious traditions that emphasize nonviolence and universal forgiveness, but reflects the reality of a brutal world where survival often required decisive violent action. Hospitality as sacred virtue. A famous story. Thor and Loki visited a poor farm. Despite limited resources, the family shared everything generously. Thor rewarded them by killing his own goats to provide a lavish feast, then resurrecting them the next morning. Hospitality was a central virtue. Denying food or shelter to a traveler was a grave evil. Thor exemplified this by keeping Bilskirner open, accepting humans into his entourage, sharing meals with mortals. Modernity values privacy and individual autonomy. Norse culture valued community and mutual obligation. Thor taught that sharing abundance wasn't optional. It was moral duty. Courage above wisdom. Odin valued wisdom, even sacrificing an eye and hanging himself for knowledge. Thor valued courage, action in the face of danger. Both were virtues, but Thor represented different priorities. Norse ethics didn't see wisdom as always superior to action. Sometimes, overthinking leads to paralysis. Sometimes, what's necessary is someone brave enough to act with imperfect information. Thor teaches it's better to act imperfectly than wait perfectly. This resonates in modern startup cultures. Done is better than perfect. Action generates feedback. Feedback generates learning. Family loyalty. Thor fiercely protected his family. When Loki cut Sif's hair, Thor nearly killed him. When giants threatened to kidnap Freya, Thor intervened immediately. Family loyalty was absolute. You could disagree with family, be frustrated with them, but never abandon them when threatened. This was a central cultural expectation. Modern society sees family relationships as more conditional. If family is toxic, you can and should distance yourself. Norse ethics didn't easily allow this. Thor personified this unbreakable loyalty. Honor through action. Norse honor was earned through deeds, not birth. Yes, Thor was Odin's son, but he was honored because he killed giants, protected gods, fulfilled oaths. Pedigree alone was insufficient. This created partial meritocracy. If you were brave, strong, reliable, you earned respect regardless of origin. Thor exemplified this by accepting Thjalfi and Roskva, children of common farmers, as valued companions. Destiny and responsibility. Norse people believed in fate, W-Y-R-D, but also in individual action. Thor knew he would die at Ragnarok, but this didn't make him fatalistic. He continued fighting, because how he arrived at destiny mattered as much as the destiny itself. You couldn't escape what you were fated for, but you could face it courageously or cowardly. This created ethical framework where acceptance of fate combined with active choice in how to meet it. Thor never passively accepted his fate. He fought toward it with every ounce of strength. That was a Norse ideal, not avoiding destiny, but meeting it magnificently. The ethics of practical protection. Thor's morality was ultimately practical. What protects? What preserves? What allows communities to flourish? These questions guided action more than abstract principles. This pragmatic ethics made Thor relevant to farmers, merchants, warriors, everyone who faced practical challenges of survival and community maintenance. He wasn't a philosopher god. He was a doer god. And in harsh Scandinavian environments where winter could kill, raids could destroy, storms could devastate, a god who prioritized practical protection over theoretical purity made perfect sense. Thank you for taking this journey through the true story of Thor. If this video helped you relax, learn, or simply pass time in peace, please remember to subscribe and leave your like to support this content. Thor's hammer protected 9 worlds. Your engagement helps protect this channel and allows us to create more content like this, calm, informative, designed for learning while you rest. May you face your own giants with Thor's courage. May you protect what you love with his dedication. And may you rest well, knowing that storms pass, but stories endure. Until next time, let the thunder roll gently into silence, and may your mind find the peace it seeks.